This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 390, Employee-Owned Companies. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about employee-owned companies with Seth Brown. Today we welcome Lullabot CEO Seth Brown. Seth has been with Lullabot since 2010, and he assumed the role of CEO in August of 2020. He's presided over the transition of Lullabot to an employee-owned company in the buyout of the previous co-founders and longtime Drupal community members Matt Westgate and Jeff Robbins. Seth started his career as a writer and web editor for Colorado College, working on the first coloradocollege.edu in 1995. He went on to work at Rollins, CU Boulder, and Penn State before taking a job with a startup digital agency called Blue Tent Marketing in 2003. After helping Blue Tent grow from 3 employees to 30, Seth joined Lullabot and helped start the client services area of the business. Seth has been in the Drupal community since 2007, and a little fun fact is that he is taller than Dries. Seth, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks. It's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development, and today my co-hosts are, as usual, John Picozzi, solution architect at EPAM.
Hello, everyone. Seth, has anybody ever called you the tallest man in Drupal before? I think we should get that.
I think it's been alleged. I'm not sure if it can be proven, but yeah.
I think we start that today. I feel
they're
like
tall in Europe. I feel like those European European Drupalists there might be some really tall ones out there, but yeah.
Well, but before I move on, how tall are you?
6'8".
6'8". Okay, yeah, that's
Dries is 6'5". I know that because I'm 6'3". And so, Seth, when was the last time you were around someone who was taller than you? Would be the question. Because I was at like a concert, and there was a guy who was like 8 feet, and I was just like, I can't believe I'm looking up to this person. He was gigantic. Because this height.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of happens more and more. It didn't used to when I was younger, but there's a lot of young guys out there that are taller than me, and I recently ran into a 6'10" guy that was about twice as wide and much bigger, stronger. It was wild. So it happened this winter at a party. Big guy from Holland.
Also joining us, as you heard, is Jacob Rockowitz for the 3rd week. He's a module maintainer at the Big Blue House. Jacob is the maintainer of the web form module and now the schema.org blueprints module for Drupal. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me back. Looking forward to the conversation.
Also, this is your last chance to register for the Nerd Summit. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, Jen?
Hi, my name is Jen. Are you a nerd? Yep, me too. And I want to make sure you know about Nerd Summit, an inclusive community building 3-day tech conference being held March 17th through 19th, 2023 at UMass Amherst in Amherst, Massachusetts. I work in software development, but I'm actually not a developer. And what I love about Nerd Summit is the wide variety of professions and experience levels that are represented. Nerd Summit's Friday and Saturday sessions will cover a wide variety of topics, including accessibility, leadership and career goals, tech tools, Drupal, development best practices, and much more. Our Friday keynote is the art of live coding, and Saturday's keynote is creativity under constraint and utilizes real-life Legos. There's also a Friday evening party, and Sunday is dedicated to even more training sessions. Tickets are just $50 and include breakfast and lunch Friday and Saturday. Reduced price and free tickets are also available. Visit nerdsummit.org to get your tickets and sign up for our Slack and newsletter. Sponsorship opportunities are also still available for this year's conference. Check it out, Nerd Summit, nerdsummit.org, and see you there.
Thanks, Jen. John, myself, and Stephen Cross will be at Nerd Summit, although I don't think we'll all be there at the same time. But if you see us, definitely say hi. Okay, and now to talk about our module of the week, let's bring in Martin Anderson-Klutz, Senior Solutions Engineer at Acquia and maintainer of a number of modules of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, Nick. This week, I thought we would talk about the entity registration module, which allows users on your Drupal site to register for events, as an example, really anything that's an entity. So the module was originally created in September of 2011, and the most recent version is 3.0 Beta 5, which is ready for Drupal 10. Has been quite actively maintained in recent months, number of releases. And there are 371 issues open, but only 5 of them are for the 3.0 branch, and 3 of those were actually fixed in recent releases. So really, there are no open bugs at this point. In terms of usage, it's currently in use by over 5,000 websites, but the vast majority of those are actually Drupal 7. And the 3.x branch looks to be maintained by John Altman primarily, who also maintains the Commerce registration module for using registration with Drupal Commerce. Internally, how it works is you create fieldable registration types, so similar to content types, that can capture data during registration. So think of like t-shirt size or dietary requirements. Then you would add a reference to a registration type on the entity that you want as a field. And then people can then use that to register. And that can be displayed on that parent entity as either a link or a form directly within the entity display, or you can actually have it as sort of a tab on the entity display as well. It provides functions commonly associated with registrations. So, maximum number of registrations, automated reminders to registrants, and so on. It also has workflows integration, including a registration workflow submodule to add permissions and operations for workflow transitions. And in addition to all of that, there's also a registration scheduled action submodule to set up sort of scheduled emails based on your registration settings. So that's a quick rundown, but let's talk about the entity registration module.
I think I've actually used this. I mean, that's one of the things with Drupal 7 being out for so long. And it's been so long since I've used it. I don't remember if it was this specific module, but I think I used it for a fencing club to help set up private lesson registrations. And it was one of those things that, registrations is one of those things that it's an easy problem to ask for, but it's a very difficult problem to solve. So it's nice to have a solution like this. I mean, people would just say like, oh, I want to have these appointments that people can register for, or these events that people can register for. You think like, oh, that's, it's 2 sentences, but actually handling like, how do you do that? How do you do reminders? How do you make sure you don't get too many? Can you prevent, if there's payment involved, there's another level. But yeah, I think I used this back in the day, and it was, it was complex, but it's solving a complex problem.
Yeah, I think this one, I mean, the machine name is actually registration. So they probably added entity at the front when it was rewritten for sort of, modern versions of Drupal. So it probably works, I would say, a fair bit differently. I think there was basically an entire rewrite for, Drupal, the modern versions of Drupal there. I know for myself, the whole registration space is something that I had looked around a lot to find something. As listeners may know, I maintain Smart Date and some related modules, and registration is something that often comes up for people who are creating events. And there are definitely other modules in that space. I feel like in Drupal 7, there were probably more options, but it's been a long time coming to really have something that's fairly easy to use. I think the modern version, at least in the time that I've played around with it, seems like it's fairly intuitive. It's much the same as sort of setting up a content type and adding whatever fields you need to sort of capture data. And the process seems to be pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I think your point about Drupal 7, this is a more universal solution. And in Drupal 7, people just created like registration ecosystems for just events. And this is a lot broader, which is a nice approach. Again, it seems very well maintained, by the way. I'm going through the notes, and the maintainer is just keeping track of everything, even explaining the differences between the versions. Looks like a really good system.
Yeah, it's always nice to see. I mean, maintaining the module page is something that takes more effort than I think people realize too. Making sure it's up to date and accurate, and seeing that a module maintainer is taking that care is definitely a good sign as well. Well, thank you, Martin. Always glad to hear your thoughts on Module of the Week, and we'll see you next week. Okay, let's start off with let's start off with the question that's probably on everybody's mind that saw the title of the show. Can you tell us what employee ownership of a company is?
Yeah, I mean, at its most basic, it just means that the employees are the shareholders of the company. So in Lullabot's case, we're a corporation, we have stock, the employees own that stock through a trust. We are what's called an ESOP, and I'm happy to go as deep or as shallow as you want on that. That's a somewhat technical rabbit hole, but that's how we accomplished employee ownership. But suffice it to say that on January 1st of 2021, the former owners, which also included stock options that were held by employees, minority owners, Matt and Jeff's remaining ownership, all of that stock was sold to the company. And then the company turned around and sold that stock to a trust, which holds the stock on behalf of the employees who are the beneficiaries of that trust. And that protects them from tax liability related to their ownership.
So ESOP, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds to answer your question about that, but ESOP really just is to do with how retirement plans are handled for the employees. Is that like a simplification?
An ESOP is a kind of a retirement plan, just like a 401k is a kind of retirement plan. It is governed under the same law. There's a law called ERISA. But in this case, it deals specifically with holding the stock of the company for the employees. And then that stock is allocated over 20 years, actually. So 5% a year gets allocated to the active employees who are working. So it's kind of a long-term game. And so for a few years, the trust will still hold the majority of the stock. It will not be allocated, but it's getting allocated as we go.
Okay.
So let's move to talk specifically about Lullabot now and their choice to become an employee-owned company. Can you give us some insight as to why that was a choice that was made and how you got there?
Absolutely. Yeah, John. So Matt Westgate really deserves, I think, a lot of the credit for this vision and this dream. Years and years and years ago, probably, I don't know, I want to say 2014, 13, even going way back. I think Matt was always kind of a visionary, and he was thinking like, one, I want things to be more equal. And two, I'd love to exit someday. He wasn't ready to exit at that point, and have the culture that we've built, the kind of company that we are, be sustainable and endure. And when you sell to another company, that's not always the case, right? Like if you get acquired, the acquiring company has a lot to say about what they're going to do with, with the company that they've purchased. And so becoming an ESOP was a way to sustain Lullabot's culture, Lullabot's leadership, what we've built over all of these years, while also allowing, Matt and Jeff also to complete his exit. So they were essentially able to have their shares bought out and take that equity off the table and then have that equity be in the hands of the employees.
So what was the process like to move Lullabot to an employee-owned company? Like, where did you even start? Like, what was like? Do you sit and get everyone in a room together and say we're doing this, or is there? Well, no, it's a really
surprise.
Does it top level, bottom level? Is it
It was a top level initiative, and it had a lot to do with the owners being ready to exit, ready to sell their stake. It is a very complicated, intricate process that I don't think you want me to say too much about to go into the details, but it's usually like a 6-figure in legal and accounting fees type transaction just to set up the structure. Wow. ESOP plans are, even though they're sort of can be set up and pre-approved by the IRS, it's sort of like getting Drupal core, but then there's a lot of configuration that needs to happen to actually make it meaningful. And if you want to make any changes, you're basically forking something, and you could never have that fork merged back into the main plan. So you're going to maintain it for the rest of time. And so there's a lot of decisions and thinking that go into the legal side of it. And then also you've got to get valuations. A fair price needs to be determined for an arm's length transaction. It's very important that the IRS and the DOL, Department of Labor, care a lot that the employees are sold the company at a fair price, so that the trust buys the company at a fair price. Usually the exiting owners will end up getting less than they would if they pursued an acquisition. But a lot of things get to stay the same. And Matt and Jeff didn't necessarily need to leave Lullabot. They were ready to, Matt was ready to leave Lullabot. Jeff had already left, but they wouldn't have had to, like me, who was a minority owner before the transaction. I've stayed on. And so I was both a selling, minority shareholder, and now I'm receiving stock allocations in relatively equal proportion to everyone else as I continue to work here. So I get to be an owner in the new Lullabot as well, which is really inspiring and cool.
Do you bring in outside experts to help with this? Or you guys figure it out on your own, or like, because you mentioned,
you definitely bring in outside experts. It's legally, it's very complicated. Again, 6 figures in legal fees initially is one of the barriers to entry for ESOPs. Mm-hmm. You kind of have to almost be at a, I don't know, I'm going to throw some numbers out that I probably shouldn't, but let's say a $7 to $10 million company before you can even think about doing this, just because you're going to spend a lot of money on the legal and accountancy. On the other side of that, there are tax savings. As an S Corp, your federal taxes are forgiven to whatever extent you're an ESOP. So we're a 100% ESOP. So that's one of the incentives that the government gives in order to further the cause of employee ownership. And that also creates sort of the liquidity over a long period of years to sort of buy out the former owners who have essentially said, we come up with a fair price, and now we don't necessarily have all of that money. So what we do is we say, here's an IOU, like Jacob, Nick, John, we owe you X, $1 million or whatever for the company, and we're going to pay that over 10 years with a fair interest rate. And that's an unsecured loan that the owners are giving to the company. So it's a little risky for them to do that. But if you really believe in the company being a sustainable entity, it's hopefully a good bet, and you get a little bit of interest along the way as your money is paid out. And the tax savings helps the company to afford to do all of this.
And I imagine it was further complicated by the fact that you're distributed and you have employees all over the world, right? So you're not dealing just with the US, you're also dealing with...
the phantom stock side of this, which is how we cover our international teams in Canada and the UK and Spain, is unusual. Let's just put it that way. And you don't really want to be a special snowflake ESOP, because it's kind of like, going back to our analogy of like forking Drupal, like now you've got to maintain all of that, and you've got your own customizations that are, unique and involve a lot of legal work. But we definitely wanted to be all inclusive in this, and those folks are as much Lullabots as anyone else at Lullabot. So that was an important piece for us to try to figure out.
What were some of the example sites or example companies rather, that were already employee owned that you maybe look to for inspiration or talk to as kind of mentors?
Yeah, I mean, some of the ones, I'll just start with like some companies, ESOPs, famous ESOPs that people would know, like Publix Supermarkets is an ESOP. They're one of the biggest. If you live in the South, you're probably familiar with them. There's a lot of manufacturing companies. SRC Holdings is a very famous company that was started by Jack Stack, who, wrote pretty famous books, Great Game of Business and Stake in the Outcome, about, creating an ESOP in the early days and then growing that ESOP. And then as the ESOP got bigger and bigger, solving the problems like, wow, all of our employee owners are rich now. How can we get the cash to actually buy them out as they all get to retirement? Because it's going to cost us a lot of money now. And we don't have that cash laying around. Enron was an ESOP, which is one of the reasons that I think there's so much scrutiny applied by the DOL and the IRS on ESOPs. So
Who was
the
it?
vehicle of ESOPs.
Enron.
Enron was an ESOP?
You have to.
Enron was an ESOP.
No
Yeah,
way.
I probably shouldn't mention that, but yeah. So, I mean, you'd be surprised. There's thousands and thousands of ESOPs. And in general, it's used to further employee ownership. And if you go to an ESOP conference, that is very much the energy, the ethos, the excitement. But there are also some bad actors in the past that have misused the ESOP vehicle. And that's why we have so many tests and so much administrivia that we have to go through every year. Reviewed financial statements, valuations make sense, right? You've got to give your employee owners the value of the company every year and tell them what their shares are worth. But there's all kinds of other tests that we go through as well to make sure we're not top heavy, that the money isn't disproportionately going to a controlling group or something like that. Yeah.
I just going to interject here. The one that was most surprising that I found about recently was King Arthur's Flour. We were buying some flour the other day. And I was like, this is an employee-owned company. I was like, I was like, oh, wait. And we're talking about that in a couple of weeks. But yeah.
Also a Drupal site.
Yeah.
Yes. Also, there's a lot of overlap. Right. The National Center for Employee Ownership, the NCEO, which I think is the best source of information about ESOPs and a great place to go learn about ESOPs, is also a Drupal site. NCEO.org.
Awesome.
Yeah, but also wasn't the brewery in Fort Collins that makes Fat Tire, what's it called? New Belgium. I believe they were employee owned. They're not anymore. I think they went through another transaction, but they were an ESOP. Yeah, there's a lot of probably surprising household names that are either partially an ESOP or entirely an ESOP.
Interesting.
So I know early on, Jeff and Matt, being having an office before Lullabot was scattered about. They had an office in Providence, Rhode Island, and both of those guys live locally here. And my wife actually works for an employee-owned company, and I know that Matt was talking to their leadership team kind of in the early days to kind of get their take on it and figure out what were the pros and cons and how they could go about doing it. So it does feel like there's a lot of similarity between like open source software and the ESOP community where, people are trying to help one another.
Yeah, the ESOP community is so inspiring, much like the Drupal community. It's a lot of people trying to do the right thing in the world and share knowledge as opposed to hoard knowledge. How can we lift each other up as opposed to trying to consolidate knowledge and or money in a few hands? It's like, how can we spread this in as many hands as possible, as many minds as possible?
Yeah, there's some great similarities there. Seth, let's change the focus from overall employee ownership to employees themselves, and talk a little bit about kind of how you feel about employee ownership, and do you think that it improves company culture? Like, is there an improvement gained by saying, hey, we're an employee-owned company?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this is one of those questions where, you ask 70 people at Lullabot and you'll get 70 different answers about, how it's impacted them. I think, the first answer is yes. I think most people would say yes, it has been an improvement. It's great to have this additional benefit. At some level, an ESOP is just a retirement benefit. Lullabot also has a 401k. Now we have an ESOP. So there's sort of like a very clinical definition of what it means to be an ESOP. And for the most part, we still run the company just as we did before. We have a leadership team. We don't vote on everything. We're not necessarily a commune. There are a few things which legally we would have to vote on, but those things are very, like recapitalization or acquisition of the company would go to a shareholder vote, but almost nothing else. So our governance is very much the same. Our day-to-day lives are very much the same. But when I go to retreats, and Lullabot's been we've been remote since 2006. We've been distributed all along. Matt and Jeff had that Providence Activity Center that you're talking about, John, for a few years, but all of us have always been wherever. So we get together once a year, and at the last two retreats, the energy is really different. I just feel like people are inspired, invigorated. They want to talk about how to grow the business, how to make the business better. There's been a little bit of a shift from what can the company do for me to what can I do for the company, because now those things have actually aligned. In a lot of companies, I think there's a friction between what's best for the employees and what's best for the shareholders. The employees are saying, hey, we want higher wages, and the shareholders are saying, we want more profits, and those things are fundamentally at odds. And at Lullabot, those things have come into alignment now. And I think that has really inspired a lot of folks to take a different level of sort of ownership in their work, the service they provide to our clients, how they think about the business. We continue to combine that with a lot of financial literacy work within the company, like training people on everything from financial statements to valuations to, we sort of do these sessions at retreats to just bring everyone's financial literacy up. And I think that is starting to have an impact. Yeah. So,
it's interesting. So a couple of things that you said there and that I wanted to follow up on, it must be exciting, like to see people kind of, or new employees to Lullabot, right, kind of light up when they get that. And I'm sure you're not like watching them as you deliver the news, but like when they get that first ESOP statement of like, hey, you've just been awarded this many shares. And oh, by the way, they're worth this much money. Like, I think that's when people really start to get it. Like, oh, like, I have skin in the game. Like the better the company does, the better I do. Right. So like there's some ownership there to be able to grow, the company and want to see the company do well. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people, love just the nature of equity itself, like not just equity in the sense of stock, but equity in the sense of equality. Like an ESOP brings inequality of ownership to everyone. Now, there's a little bit of this phenomena with being a baby ESOP. We're a baby ESOP. We're 2 years old. Where, like, if you think of it as buying a house with no money down, it's like, yeah, the house might be worth $1 million, but you put no money down, so you have $1 million mortgage. So your equity value is not that high in the house yet. And so as we're paying down that debt, that equity value is going to go up and up and up and eventually approach the enterprise value of the company. And that's where I think those statements are going to get more exciting. And there's a little bit of, in the early baby ESOP years, weathering the sort of lower share price and just trying to imagine, like, what can this be? What is it going to be? And that's hard to determine because there's a lot of futures for Lullabot. We might do great, we might struggle, all those sorts of things. But I still think there's an extent to which it changes everything the day you do this, even while that share price is relatively unimpressive. Because
if one other thing I wanted to point there, Nick, and then you can feel free to go ahead. But one other thing that you mentioned was, the employee ownership, the employee owned company isn't necessarily like a democracy, right? Everything isn't up for a vote. Like, you are the CEO, you are running the company the best way that you can. Right. And I think that like some people may go, well, oh, that's weird. But like, it's very similar to if you invest in stocks in the stock market. Like, you may get a proxy vote every year, but that proxy vote has like 3 questions on it. You're not dictating, employee policy or how the day-to-day running of the company happens. So it's very similar in that regard, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Lullabot has always been a fairly flat organization, and we try to be democratic where we can. And certainly we try, I as a leader, I believe in consensus and trying to lead with consensus as much as I can. But as you're saying, John, that's not a legal requirement of the ESOP necessarily. That's more of a cultural facet of Lullabot. And yeah, on the legal side, it's like there are certain things that the shareholders get to vote on but they're limited. Again, recapitalization, sale of substantially all of the stock of the company, so merger or acquisition, those sorts of things can go to a vote. The trustee also in the beginning, remember, owns 100% of the stock and then is allocating 5% a year. So while the trustee, which is an external, for us, it's a company called Great Bank, while the trustee still owns the majority of the stock, they also vote the majority of the stock. And they have to act in the best interests as fiduciaries of the shareholders. So they really are going to vote in a way that's defensible to say, we did what was best for the shareholders, which also happen to be the employees. But you could get into some funny scenarios where, like, as a fiduciary, the trustee is saying, we want the company to be purchased by Acme, but the employees are like, we don't want to be purchased by Acme. We don't want to go work at Acme. But it's sort of like, well, as a fiduciary, we have to accept this deal. There's nothing, and it won't be for a while till the tipping point comes where the employee votes would outweigh the trustees' vote in something like that.
Right.
Interesting. So I think I'm just understanding something at this point. I just want to really quickly clarify. So essentially, what happened was the company bought itself from the owners and then sold itself to a trustee.
Yep.
Who is slowly giving it back to the employees.
Yeah, exactly. And the company has the debt on its balance sheet to those, former owners, as well as other liabilities, liabilities for the phantom stock. And then you also, from a cash perspective, this is getting a little geeky, but you also have to start to think long-term about repurchase obligation. So ESOPs have this lifespan, and I'll just talk about it really quickly, where year 0 through 5, you are paying off debt and you're building the equity value of the company relative to its enterprise value. So, again, to use our house analogy, you're paying down the mortgage, right? And that's the best thing you can do with cash. Year 5 through 10, there's sort of this sweet spot where you have extra cash because you have this tax forgiveness. A lot of times this is when ESOPs will engage in M&A, combine with other ESOPs, buy other companies, those sorts of things. But then by year 10, you got to think about this, like a company's going to turn over pretty much every 10 years. And at that point, your repurchase obligation to employees is going to be so big that it's going to actually constitute a lot of the value. And so at that point, your employee owners own a substantial amount, at least 50% of the company. And that's a lot of moolah, right, in a company that may be worth $10 million or $15 million. And so years 10 and beyond are often dealing with the repurchase obligation to the employee owners. And there's lots of different ways to do that, but that in itself can be a real challenge, and actually that's why a lot of ESOPs stop being ESOPs, is because they have to go through a merger and acquisition, a recapitalization, in order to have the cash to buy out a lot of exiting employee owners at once. So there's a lot of ESOPs that were sort of started back when ERISA first made these laws, and those were baby boomers, and they're all retiring right now. And if you're one of those ESOPs where all of your employees are boomers and they're all retiring at the same time, you've got a big problem. You've basically got to sell the company to buy out those exiting owners.
Interesting.
Yep.
So this next question, I mean, you kind of answered, are employees more engaged or dedicated if the company is employee owned? I have this general question about, get very specific. Is your retention higher of your employees in terms of, people stay longer? I mean, in our tech world, people, I don't know what the number is, but I think it's every few years they change jobs. Has that shifted at Lullaby because now they're employee owned? And I almost want to ask a very specific question. Are your shares vested? Is that part of the I mean, that's what I remember with stock options, that vesting, catch 22. They kept looping you in for 3 or 4 years for vested stocks and stuff like that. So
yeah, two great questions. I'll take the first one quick. I mean, our retention has always been pretty good. Like the average tenure at Lullabot is high. I mean, it was at one point it was 7 years. We've hired enough in recent years that I think it's come down a little bit, but it's still well above the norms in the tech industry. So retention was kind of good before, and it's been good after. And the percentage of turnover in a year hasn't changed a whole lot. I'd say we see between 8 to 10% turnover, in a year, which is, it's not huge, but some turnover. And that hasn't changed a lot since the ESOP. And we also don't have a lot of a data sample. We've only got 2 years to look at. So over time, we'll probably have a better sense of that. But I do think it helps with retention. And yes, you went right to where a lot of people's minds go, is like, is the ESOP sort of a vehicle to help with retention, and is vesting involved in that? And yeah, it is, basically. So we vest, you vest 20% after 2 years. So we had a vesting ceremony at our last retreat, and a lot of us that were here for the actual conversion to ESOP got our first 20% vesting. And some lullabots came up with the idea of actually giving us a vest and a pin that says owning, and it's like a progress bar, dot, dot, dot. It says owning, and it shows 20%. So you vest over 6 years, and there's a lot of other sort of smart protections in the way ESOPs are constructed to essentially prevent the I'm going to quit my job to like buy a house problem. You don't want to incentivize people to say, okay, I have this stock. It's really meant to be a retirement vehicle. It's not meant to be liquid cash that if you decided you all of a sudden really needed money, your best option would be to quit your job. That would be sort of a counter, incentive. And so, yeah, it's designed much like probably options programs that people might be familiar with, where there's a vesting period, but the company's contributing 100% of the stock to the employees, and they're not buying it. And in that sense, it's really powerful. Karen Stevenson did this funny exercise at the retreat. She's our CFO, COO, where basically we all got to choose whether we invested in bonds, stocks, all these different investments. There was also ESOP stock being given to us, and each team had to choose what they wanted to invest in over 5 years. And she pulled a random year from each year between 1960 or something and the present. So it might be a great year for stocks and a bad year for bonds, or vice versa, et cetera. And the exercise, we're all sort of trying to figure out, like, okay, we're trying to make the most money. But what it ended up being at the end was this aha moment where we all realized that the ESOP stock, which we were being given and had no cost basis, was going to end up being way more valuable than these equities that we were buying, where we were just getting, the capital gain essentially as our earnings. Not, we had full basis in those. Whereas in this case, you're being given that basis. So it's really powerful over time.
Interesting. So speaking of retirement, does Lullabot, I think you mentioned Lullabot still has a 401k. So ESOP,
Yep.
the
didn't change.
employee-owned stock isn't the only thing that Lullabot contributes towards retirement. Does that complicate things, or?
A lot of ESOPs drop their 401ks. We didn't feel like we wanted to, and we kind of fought for that. We felt like we like the diversification. We like the match. Everybody likes the 401k. We didn't want to like take that away and then sort of do this. We didn't want the ESOP to feel like a bait and switch of like, hey, we took this retirement plan that everyone loves and where they're invested in something as diverse as the S&P 500, and now we gave you company stock. And, instead, because that might be kind of a like, thanks, right? Like, I'd rather have my S&P 500 shares back with Vanguard. So we felt it was important to leave the 401k as is, leave the company contribution as it is, and also add the ESOP. And we just had to figure out how to afford that. And a lot of that goes to the owners being willing to take a long payout, an unsecured IOU, and sort of reasonable interest rates over a long period of time.
I think it's super important to highlight what you just said there, right? Because I imagine another scenario happens where, like, ESOPs basically say, hey, we're going to give you this retirement. We're also going to give you a 401k, but we are not going to contribute to that 401k or match what you're contributing, right? So Lullabot is an employee-owned company with ESOP, right? And then doing the 401k and also matching the 401k to a percentage, right? So I think, I think that's interesting because, I imagine a lot of companies out there probably aren't doing that, which is, I think an important point.
Yeah.
So Seth, I'm happy that I get to ask this question because I was super interested in this as somebody who's worked for a number of small agencies. Now, I work, for a big company,
very large company,
large global company. But as somebody who has worked for, smaller agencies in the past, all of which were privately owned, I'm wondering why do you think more companies in our industry specifically don't go down the employee ownership path?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of stars have to align for that to happen. I mean, you have to have owners that are willing to give up their position and to sell their company. And if it's a growing concern, they may not want to do that. They may want to continue to benefit from that entrepreneurial risk that they took when they founded the company. And that's totally legitimate. I mean, that's a big part of capitalism. That said, the other big sort of problem that I see for agencies becoming ESOPs is just size and scale. It's if you're going to spend, let's just throw out numbers. Like if you're going to need to spend $300,000 to $600,000 in legal and administrative fees and valuations, and then have an ongoing fees of $60,000 to $100,000 every year, you have to be of a certain size for that to make sense. And right. I think a lot of smaller agencies just aren't there yet. But one thing that's really cool about ESOPs is when you do get to those golden years of years 5 and 10, then you can become an acquirer. You could go to those owners and say, we'd like to buy you out and bring you into the ESOP, and you all will become shareholders of this larger enterprise. I think that's a really interesting model. And when we went to the ESOP Summit this year, there just weren't a lot of digital agencies around. And I think as there become more digital agencies in the space, the possibilities open up for more agencies to make this conversion, to make this jump. I think it's a really good thing to do for people. And I would love to see, a more equitable distribution of equity in the world in general.
So I want to clarify something you just said, because I'm not sure that I understood it. You said in years 5 and 10, other people like outside of the company have the option to come in and buy the company stock and become kind of like an employee owner. Is that, or did I misunderstand?
No, I was saying in years 5 through 10, let's say Lullabot as an example, might have some free cash flow. So let's say that in years 0 through 5, we paid off a lot of our debt. Maybe we accelerated the payment on the notes, the 10-year notes. So we paid them off faster, which is what you hope to do. Now we have this free cash flow in the form, for instance, of both our EBITDA, our profits, and the not paying taxes, not paying federal taxes. We could take some of that capital and we could, for instance, go out and buy another digital agency and bring them into our ESOP.
So our acquisition, basically.
Right. Okay. And then they don't have to go through the initial pain of paying all of that money for the legal and the financial, right? So it's as a middle ESOP, we're a baby ESOP. You get to those middle years, then you become a possibility, an entry point for other smaller companies to become an ESOP without having to have the upfront capital to do it.
Because you're acquiring those companies like in a normal acquisition. I mean, they obviously have to agree to be sold, but you're not going through the whole ESOP process with that company again, right? You're basically just saying like, we're paying your owners whatever the fair market value that they agreed to, and then you're now our employees. Surprise, you're now an ESOP.
Yeah, you're all part of this ESOP, right? So you'd still have due diligence to make sure that, whether it was, an acquisition or an asset purchase or whatever, you'd want to make sure it was a good deal for your employee owners. And both the board and the trustees would be very interested in that, because they want to make sure that you're, as fiduciaries, the value of the current shareholders is being protected. But if they see it as, contributing value, they would probably sign off and say yes. And a lot of ESOPs do grow that way and accrete that way. There's a lot of holding companies that are ESOPs that just buy lots of other little companies and or other ESOPs and kind of build these bigger sort of company of companies. And one of the reasons to do that is as you grow as an ESOP and your stock price goes up and you get bigger and bigger, you're going to start to have a bunch of, let's say, millionaires who are just employees. You know, they might be truck drivers or grocery store workers or whatever, but they've been there long enough for this ESOP that's grown and grown and grown that they have, you know, $1 million stakes in the overall company of companies. And so one of the things that Jack Stack and SRC Holdings figured out was like, if we spin off lots of companies, or if we create a company of companies, we can sort of sell a company when we need liquidity, when we need cash, and use that to help with our repurchase obligation, you know, to buy out the retiring or exiting employees.
So one thing, going back to my question, right, as to why more people don't, or more companies don't go down this path, right? We talked about kind of the financial implications, right? But it seems to me that, like, as a company owner, right, like, I am not going to live forever, right? And like, maybe there's, you know, there has to be some sort of exit plan, right? And this seems like a responsible exit plan for a company owner, as far as like, okay, I'm not going to like sell the company to somebody else. I'm not going to, like, you know, my kids aren't going to take it over, whatever that looks like. Right. This seems like a responsible exit strategy or, you know, contingency, right? If for some reason something happens to that owner. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great exit strategy that leaves the legacy, sort of the cultural legacy, you know, like owners have created this amazing culture, let's say, and you want that to live on. You may be able to get slightly more money if you sell the assets of the company to an outside buyer, you know, but they may come in, like, let's say that they're just doing a talent acquisition. You know, they may come in and say, you know, we're going to take your 10 top engineers and give them jobs at the company, and then we're going to lay everyone else off, and we're going to fire your clients. And I don't think a lot of owners would feel good about that. You know, they would feel like that's tarnishing or destroying their legacy. They may need to do that at some point because for whatever reasons they need to cash out, or they need to sell. But this is a way where you can sell and still continue, have the company continue on in very much its current form, which I think is one of the magical parts about it. And it also creates, you know, a stream. If you do the method that we did of seller financing, you're also creating cash flows for yourself with some interest for years to come, assuming, you know, the company that you sold remains a going concern.
Okay.
So that's neat.
So what is your favorite part of the ESOP, working for an ESOP company? Like, what is the big, it's for employee perspective, because we talked about the benefits for the previous owners where they're getting it, you know, they're keeping the culture. Do you feel it changed the culture? What's your favorite part of these changes?
Just mostly the ownership mentality. Jared Ponchot, who's our creative director, came up with a t-shirt for our first retreat as an ESOP. And we've always done t-shirts, but this t-shirt said Owner Camp. And just seeing people's like smiles and realization, and like seeing people greet each other at the table, like, hey owner, like there's this mentality that comes into the company of like, yeah, this is real. Like, we own this thing now. This is a meeting not just of employees, this is a meeting of shareholders now. And we want to have a say in where this is going, and we care in a different way than we did before about what happens here. And so for me, at least, working with those kind of people is really inspiring. And I've always been inspired by the people I work with at Lullabot. I mean, that's never been a problem or a challenge. I love them. But at the same time, like, yeah, there's this new element in the mix of like, just that ownership mentality, that inspiration, that level of care for the company, and that sort of sense of, you know, ask not what the company can do for you, but what you can do for the company, that shifts in the employees' minds. And that's been a beautiful thing to behold and to be a part of.
I'm going to flip that on its head and kind of ask kind of the opposite question. So what's your least favorite, or maybe the most surprising part of making that transition? Was there anything? I can imagine it wasn't all roses, aside from the upfront costs and stuff. But was there anything that was like, oh, I wish this was a little bit different?
Yeah, I mean, aside, I'm gonna just say, like, put a pin in sort of the administrivia, because that is a big deal. Like, suddenly your first few months of the year are going to all sorts of things that you never had to worry about before. Valuations and questionnaires and 409p tests and all these things that you have to do, TPA reporting. Like, yeah, anyway, that's a lot. I don't know that I fully appreciated what that was going to look like for me and our admin team. But I think the answer you're looking for is more from a team sense, and like a qualitative sense of like, well, what didn't we anticipate that's different in a weird way? And I will say, like, this is going to sound funny, but let me know if you know what I mean. It increases the material force. Like, it puts the focus more on money. Like, now you've got a bunch of people that are thinking about, what is our EBITDA? What is our growth projections? How much do we want to grow? We have, like, they start doing the math, and they're like, wow, if I want this to be really valuable for me in 5 to 10 years, we need to grow a whole lot. And that can create pressures, and it can even create divisions between, let's say, employees who are really happy with the way things are, with the work-life balance, with the, sort of like life as it is, and employees who start to think, why aren't we acquiring other companies? Why aren't we growing the value of this enterprise more rapidly? And that can introduce frictions into the culture, where you have this sort of more financially minded, like, let's go big. And the people who are sort of like, we're a small giant. I like being small. I like the quality of life. Money's not the most important thing to me. Like, I didn't come here for the money to work at Lullabot necessarily. I could have gone to Facebook for that. I don't necessarily want that to be our main focus. And so I think it does introduce those types of conversations. So far, that's a friction we've been able to navigate, and I think integrate all of those viewpoints and try to just take the middle way, between those two sort of poles. But it definitely, brings up that sort of question of materialism.
That's interesting. It sounds like it sounds like also, even if two groups want to grow, one group might think the way to grow is to pursue this company, and another might think the way to grow is to pursue that company. And yeah, that's an interesting thing I hadn't thought of.
I think one other thing there that makes that complicated, right, is the fact that depending on where people are in their journey, right, and typically that's like maybe around more related to age, right? They maybe have different thoughts about that, right? So somebody new to the company, first in, is going to say, let's take it slow. I got plenty of time here. I'm going to spend the next, 5 to 10 years here, or, 20, 30, whatever it is, and grow with this company. But somebody closer to retirement might be like, no, we gotta make that acquisition. Like, I want the maximum amount of stock value that I can get before, I'm done working. So, that's definitely something difficult to manage.
I'm nodding vigorously, because this is also just a classic issue in all ESOPs of age, where the younger people don't necessarily get it. If you're in your 20s and you've got these retirement shares in this company that aren't worth a whole lot, you're like, great, this in $4 will buy me a Starbucks. Whereas the older employees really do get it, and they're looking at retirement considerations are really important to them. And so there's also that, like, mixture of people across the spectrum, and the ESOP really is going to do a lot more to make happy and satisfy and interest the older side of your workforce, and the younger side may care a lot less. And that's where you may need to bring in other kinds of incentives or variable compensation to keep the younger side of your workforce interested in this shared enterprise.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a little bit of a training thing, right? Because those younger employees, right? They once they are vested, they get something, right? So, like you said, I think it's like, what, 2 years? So after 2 years, you get 20% vested, right? So even if you part ways, you get your 20%, right? So, like, there's something there for you after 2 years, right? If you're putting in the effort.
Exactly.
I want to take Nick's question and Jacob's question and change your perspective on it a little bit and come at it from the CEO angle, right? So you're running the company, and as you said earlier, you try to be as democratic as possible. But I wonder if there's something different from what you just talked about, that your favorite part of being a CEO of an employee-owned company. Is there something different there? Something maybe like being able to talk publicly as you are right now about being a employee-owned company?
I think, to me, like, this is going to sound maybe cliche, but I think I sleep better at night with the knowledge that the value that we're creating as a team is being shared relatively equally among the team, as opposed to accreting to one or two individuals. And I think an important thing to remember about me is I wasn't a co-founder. So even though I came into Lullabot at a riskier time than now, right? We were a 15-person company when I joined Lullabot, and by no means was our continued existence guaranteed. But like, I got a normal paycheck. Like, I wasn't taking that original entrepreneurial risk at all, necessarily. And I think, when you found a company, you're taking a huge risk. Like, and sometimes you can barely pay yourself for years. Sometimes you're doing it with credit cards. And the way that gets paid back over time is in the growth of that equity. But I think after a certain point, as you become an operational company, you become let's say you pass the $10 million mark or the 50 employee mark or whatever that is, and you're a fairly stable enterprise. Is it still fair for most of the wealth being generated by the company to accrue to a few individuals? At what point have they kind of gotten enough out of that initial risk that they took? And at that point, I feel like there's almost a moral imperative that wealth should start to be shared among all of the people that are creating it, because we're all making Lullabot happen. Everyone at Lullabot is contributing to our success and our income. And so I really like the idea that we all get to share in equally, in the equity. Like, I keep coming back to that word, and its dual meaning. But the equitableness of it all feels good. And I feel like as a leader, there can be a bit of ick, at least for me, if you're starting to be rich and a lot of your employees are struggling, or, making a paycheck to paycheck, kind of wage. I'm not sure how that feels right to folks.
It just means that you're a decent human being, and you guys at Lullabot and other employee-owned companies are trying to leave the world a little bit better than you found it, is what I'm hearing, right? I mean, I think there are two schools of, well, there are probably more than two, but I'm going to distill it down to two, right? There's one of like, hey, if I'm doing well and then I distribute that wellness to the rest of my company, like, we're all going to rise together, right? Or there's that like, hey, everybody works for me and I'm going to do well and I'm going to keep going up, and everybody else is just going to kind of keep along, but just not gonna be as fair and, as you said, equitable. So that's a super great insight.
And there's also the sustainability piece of, like, Matt walked away, Jeff walked away. The truth is, like, I could walk away and Lullabot is going to continue to thrive. Like, it is no longer tied to a specific individual. And I think that's a beautiful piece of this too, that as a CEO, you sleep better at night, right? Like,
sure.
I wonder about those people that own private companies where everything's bound up with them and their tax forms and their lives and that's a lot.
I can tell you right now, as an employee of a company like that, over the course of my career, I have thought numerous times, like, hey, if our leadership gets taken down by a bus or a car accident, like, what happens to this company? Like, am I out of a job? Like, how does that work? Right. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, it's, as a leader, you're thinking about that, but I can guarantee that, previously your employees may have been thinking about that as well.
Yeah. Lots of ways you sleep better at night, for sure.
Mm.
I'm curious, and I'm not trying any way to imply that Lullabot was like this before the transition, so keep that in mind. But a lot of agencies have kind of divide employees kind of into cost center employees and employees that generate revenue, right? And that I wonder if employee ownership kind of reduces some of that pressure on, one of the areas that many times companies see as a cost center and not something that's helpful is IT, right? They try to cut IT as much as possible and try to make them do more with less. I wonder if being employee owned, some of it is, well, let's make the company run as smoothly as possible, even if that means those budgets are bigger, or like experiments, like Tugboat was kind of an internal project that became something at Lullabot. Do those types of experiments and initiatives become easier in an ESOP as well?
Yeah, I mean, the question about overhead, right? Like, quote unquote, the dreaded, like below the SG&A line. So, admin, sales, and marketing.
Yeah.
I feel like Lullabot always had a healthy relationship to knowing that those things were necessary and a part of our thriving, and that even though those people weren't technically producers, they were just as valuable as everybody else. And so we've been working with financial literacy for years and years and years before we became an ESOP. And so I remember back in 2012 starting to help people understand all of the pieces. And so that hasn't been as much of a change or a shift. I feel like we were kind of had a good, healthy respect for, our admin and sales and marketing folks before, and we continue to after. As far as experiments go, it's funny. Like at some level, you're gonna hate this answer, Nick. I feel like it's almost the opposite of what you're asking, what you want to hear. But like I would say, when you're a private owner and it's your money at risk, it's pretty easy to say like, hey, I've got this bang up new app idea. Let's go out and build this thing. And it's my money. And if we lose my money, that's my problem. And I don't care. And you don't care. So let's do this. Whereas once you become an ESOP, there's like a board of independent board members. There's a trustee. Like they need to be convinced that, there's a valuation process where they don't just look at your financials, but they give you like a 10-page like Word doc of questions about, SWOT analysis and business prospects and side, like, so everything is under a huge amount of scrutiny. And so I think the burden of proof that something as an experiment is going to be successful is much, much higher in an ESOP than it was before under private owners who could do things like, let's make a shoot app, let's make Tugboat, let's try these cool things. It's like now it's like that has to fall under a lot more scrutiny and make a lot more sense financially before it can be greenlit.
Yeah. Stability is the priority. That makes perfect sense. Sorry, John.
No, that's okay. I was just wondering. So, like, obviously, there's like that before you take company money and spend it on building a product or like dumping it into something, right? There's oversight there. That makes complete sense. But I'm wondering, like, do you see, and we don't have to get into the specifics, but I imagine most of your employees are salaried. Like, do you see a lot of employees like kind of banding together? Like, hey, I have this idea. Can we like try it out for, and see if we can build a POC, and like, then we can bring that to leadership and try to get more funding because the company's employee owned. Like they have, they're less
that
about
feeling of agency and empowerment. Mm-hmm.
What's that? Sorry.
Yeah. Like they feel empowered. They feel like they have agency as owners to pursue ideas. Yeah. I think we are seeing that. And then we're also having to educate people, to some degree of saying like, our hurdle rate, our cost of capital is, we know what that is. And we've got to make sure that any project that we take on is going to clear that hurdle rate, or else we have better uses of money to invest. So I think the ideating you're talking about, John, is definitely happening and should happen. But maybe it's that next phase where something takes a jump to being like funded by the company to, the tune of 6 figures or more, where it's like, okay, now this is real money we're talking about. Then you have to prove that that investment is better than other uses of cash, such as, for instance, paying down debt, which gives you a guaranteed return. Exactly what the return on capital is for that. Not to mention investing in the core business. which has its own, hurdle rate. Like it's, let's say that returns 17% a year after year after year. That's actually a pretty high hurdle rate, so it's like, you got to prove that this new initiative is worth, the investment. And I think that is something that your board and your trustee are gonna, if I go to them, if I'm like, hey, I want to fund this initiative, those are going to be their first questions. Like, what is this return on investment? Is this a good use of cash? Do we have better uses of cash? So, yeah.
Okay, so to wrap this up, this is a really key question. If someone is running a company and is interested in an employee ownership model, where do you think is the best place for them to start? The first steps?
I would say get inspiration by reading a book called Stake in the Outcome by Jack Stack, which is just we can put in the show notes. It's a great book about a journey of an ESOP from crazy beginnings to, great fortune in the long run, and all of the problems and challenges that ESOPs go through, but also the triumphs. That's a really great book and a good place to start. It also talks a lot about why it's important that we as Americans actually share ownership and own companies. And this could be as important in the long run as like home ownership has been for our democracy and for distribution of wealth. So I think that's a great place to start. And then I would say nceo.org, the National Center for Employee Ownership, is a great resource, a great place to start. And if you were an owner who was thinking of like, I'm interested in this, I think I might want to explore this further, the NCEO will consult with you at a very reasonable rate, much more reasonable than calling a private lawyer that works in the ESOP world. And they can sort of point you in the right direction to the right resources for your size, for your needs. They can even kind of do an on-the-fly assessment of like, are you at the big enough point where an ESOP makes sense? Are you more about, so one of the first things that Matt and I did was we called up a guy named Corey Rosen, who is at the NCEO, and he spent, an hour with us talking about our aspirations, dreams, reasons, the state of the company, and then kind of pointed us in the right direction to the right kinds of resources that we needed for next steps. And the NCEO offers that consulting at a pretty reasonable rate. I think when we did it, it was like $300 an hour, and it's a contribution to a nonprofit, which compared to the legal hourly rates is quite
reasonable,
affordable. Yeah.
Well, Seth, thank you for joining us. This has been fascinating. I feel like we barely scratched the surface on this topic. I mean, I have so many more questions.
I know,
but I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. This was a real pleasure. This is the first time I've actually really gotten to do this in a Drupal community forum. We're going to speak again at DrupalCon about rewiring Lullabot and the journey to becoming an ESOP. So catch us in Pittsburgh if you're curious to learn more. Yeah.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
And you can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD promo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter for show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choose Become a Patron. And you'll get an extended pre-show today if you are a patron. Well, Seth, as we wrap up, if our listeners want to get in touch with you, had any questions, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
Seth at lullabot.com. I'm actually not on Twitter, so hit me up on LinkedIn at LinkedIn. Seth L. Brown on LinkedIn, and or email is fine too.
Awesome. And Jacob, how about you?
Jay Rockowitz everywhere on Drupal.org, Twitter, my website.com, and I think LinkedIn. I even have that space too.
John, how about you?
I am John Picozzi on all the major social networks and Drupal.org, and you can find out more about EPAM at epam.com.
And you can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. Have a good one, everyone.
See you next week.